All right, as we continue to bring you analysis as well as stories that are making news this hour, European Union Foreign Minister Josep Borrell says they are not asking South Africa to choose sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Borrell, who is also the EU's top diplomat, was hosted by International Relations and Cooperation Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor in Pretoria early this week. SABC News International News editor Sophie Mokoena was in conversation with Borrell and joins us now live. Sophie, thank you so much for your time this hour. So now there are reports that things have intensified between Russia and Ukraine. Is this true, and what more do we know about this?
Well, thank you, Mkolisi. Indeed, with me I have the European Union Commission Vice President, who has led a high-powered delegation of the European Union representatives from different countries. As you know, that it is a powerful group in terms of trade and investment around the world, but also in relation to the current political climate in the world. No one can ignore what has been happening around the world, particularly with the war in Ukraine. Who can forget the COVID-19 and the impact? And I am going to be in conversation with Vice President Josep Borrell. Good morning, Vice President.
Good morning.
How are you?
Delighted to be here.
How is South Africa treating you?
Well, it has been a very interesting and intense visit. A positive one, and it gave me the opportunity to know a little bit more about South Africa.
Thank you so much. Quite hot. I know you are from the northern hemisphere where it's cool. So let's get into this heat. Vice President, perhaps if you can sum up your visit to South Africa, what was the purpose of this high-powered delegation?
Well, South Africa is considered a strategic partnership for the European Union. It is the only African country that has this, let's say, qualification or consideration, a strategic partner. It means that our relations are important. We are the first investor, we are the first trade partner. From the economic point of view, we are strategically important. Secondly, South Africa is a regional leader in Africa, and we want to engage in order to deal with the geopolitical questions. Climate is one of them. The climate transition has to be a just one, otherwise it will not happen. And that's why we have an agreement to push for a transition that distributes the cost of it. Secondly, we have to talk about the geopolitical challenges. The war in Ukraine is one of them, one of the most important of them.
You spoke about the partnership between South Africa, almost like a bilateral with the Union, quite important. In terms of post-Brexit, the relationship with South Africa, are they still strong? Are we still your largest trading partner on the continent?
Still, why not? Certainly, our relations with South Africa are increasing politically, economically, from the point of view of trade. Our trade, your exports to Europe increase, our investment in South Africa increases. We disagree in a certain number of issues. Certainly, we still have some irritants in our trade relationship. We have been discussing about it. Certainly, we see that South Africa is taking a position in the United Nations vote that is not our. And this is an additional reason for us to engage more, to discuss more. You know, when you disagree in something among friends and partners, what do you have to do is to sit and talk.
Before we get into geopolitics, finally on trade, the issue of citrus, the export thereof from South Africa to the European Union, there were challenges. Did you discuss this, and are we likely to find a solution?
Yes, certainly we discussed about it. And when the Prime Minister of Spain came to South Africa, my President Sanchez, they discussed, and when the President of the European Council, the highest representative of the European Union in the world, came here, they also discussed about it. This is one of the irritants I was referring to. And yes, I know that's a problem. We have been trying to give a period of adaptation to the new regulations in order to support the African exporters, South African exporters. The situation is still not solved. The problem is still not solved. We will continue working and engaging in order to look for a solution. But for the time being, the disagreement remains. It is not the only one. There are others in our bilateral trade relations that also have to be looked at.
On geopolitics, let's look at the war in Ukraine. You pointed out that South Africa is a powerful voice on the continent and globally. This is how South Africa has positioned itself, particularly after independence, to ensure that the country does contribute to peace and security, not only in our country, the region and the continent, but around the world. Now, there's this question of the war in Ukraine and South Africa's position, a neutral player. You had a discussion with Minister Naledi Pandor about this issue. Can you take us through the discussions? What was the crux of the discussions and what are your concerns?
The same discussion that we had at the G20 meetings some months ago. As you know, South Africa has abstained in all votes in the United Nations. So South Africa has not condemned the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I understand there are historical reasons. I don't want to tell to anyone, to any independent and sovereign country, how do they have to manage their foreign policy. It's free. A free country has its own foreign policy. And I understand that there are reasons why South Africa doesn't want to be in a bad relationship with Russia. But this is one thing. And another thing is to not recognize that this has been a clear violation of the United Nations Charter, that this has been an invasion for a powerful country against its neighbor. To not recognize that there is a systematic destruction of this country and killing of civilians. Yes, I understand historical reasons to try to manage the relationship with Russia, but I think this is one thing. And another thing is not say clearly that this is a violation of the United Nations Charter that has to be condemned.
Some are saying it's not about the relationship between South Africa and Russia, the earlier relationship before this new democratic dispensation in terms of the USSR, but it is about NATO expanding its territory. It's about the agreements that were made prior to ensure that Russia is guaranteed its territory integrity and security. How do you respond to that? That it's not, South Africa is not doing this because of they have relationship with Russia. In fact, the new administration, some of the components of the South African governing party alliance partners might have a problem, but it's about honoring agreements.
Honoring agreements. Let's just start by the agreement that Russia signed, the engagement of Budapest, where Russia engaged on respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in exchange of Ukraine abandoning their nuclear weapons and giving back to Russia. Russia signed a treaty engaging in exchange of that on respecting the borders of Ukraine and its territorial integrity. Secondly, Ukraine is not member of NATO, and there is no NATO troops in Ukraine. There is no NATO arms in Ukraine. To say that NATO was a threat to Russia through Ukraine is a complete lie.
Now, when you look at what has transpired, South Africa and other countries on the continent, particularly the non-aligned member countries globally, are pushing for a peaceful resolution. But we see the United States of America, Germany, and recently other countries like Poland, United Kingdom, sending tanks. I mean, the world is now afraid that we are likely to see a disaster. And recently, one of the senior officials in Kremlin saying that the tank versus nuclear. How do we resolve this war talk and sending of tanks in that region, which resemble a war zone, now a fully fledged world war?
But it's a fully war zone. Yes, it's a real war. 500 people are being killed every day in the front line. Certainly it's a war. A war started by Russia aggressing, invading, bombing, destroying Ukraine. Please, look at the things the way they are. Certainly it's a war. And certainly if we don't support Ukraine, Ukraine will be on their knees, surrendering in front of Russia. When some people tell me, oh, you are supporting Ukraine and you are prolonging the war, what do you suggest? Do you suggest stopping supporting Ukraine? And then what's happened?
But can't the multilateral organizations intervene, or countries, powerful countries intervene, the UN, to try and find an amicable solution to save lives? Yes. Rather than sending tanks, because it's quite scary now.
But we send tanks because a country is being aggressed. If you were an Ukrainians and you were every night seeing the missiles bombing your house and killing your people, you would appreciate if someone helped you. It's clear we support Ukraine, and the more Russia is attacking Ukraine, the more we will support Ukraine. Peace. Certainly we want peace. Ask Putin if he wants peace. South Africa is in a good relationship with Putin, it seems, it looks like. Use this good relation with Putin in order to convince him to stop the war.
When Foreign Affairs Minister of Russia was in South Africa on Monday, I really asked him a question, a similar question, hard question, in terms of why can't the warring factions find an amicable solution and engage in peace process or peace talks. I even asked him about the possibility of appointing a credible mediator. He pointed out that America has been pushing President Zelensky not to agree to the negotiation process. What's your view on that? Is Sergei Lavrov correct to say President Zelensky is not willing to engage in finding an amicable solution?
Look, President Zelensky has presented a peace plan of 10 points. I don't know if you know it. I've been asking my South Africa counterparts if they know it. It is the only initiative I know in order to build peace. Which has been the proposal from the Russian side? In order to build peace, bombing more. They bomb every day more. So which credibility do they have in order to ask for peace? Everybody who went to the Kremlin before the starting of the war and after, everybody, starting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and all European leaders, Chancellor of Germany, President of France, Chancellor of Austria, I don't want to tell all of them, but the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the answer was the same. I have military objectives, and as far as I don't get these military objectives, I will continue the war. This is the Russia position, my God.
Vice President, let's turn to the region. You are also assisting in countries such as Mozambique, you know, the Sahel region, the DRC. Your cooperation in the region, is it becoming a fruitful exercise in terms of dealing with these conflicts on the continent? And what would you like to see happening?
Look, it's a vast question. It's not the same thing Mozambique than Central African Republic or other countries in the Sahel. Well, we were in Mozambique because the Mozambican government asked us to support. And we sent a training mission for the Mozambican army, and we provide about 100 million euros to equip this army. We support financially the Rwandese army, and we support financially the SADC military mission. Both, 3 military missions, our training, the Mozambican army, the SADC, and the Rwandese army are doing a good job. And we are there because the Mozambican army has to come. Same thing in the Sahel. Without the European intervention many years ago in Mali, in Burkina
Faso,
in Chad, without this intervention, this country wouldn't exist anymore. They would have disintegrated by the fight among different factions. It could be like Libya it is today, unhappily. So certainly the fight against terrorism has not been won. And if people come into the government through a military coup, because let's remember which is the legitimacy of someone, of anyone. If people taking the government through a military coup or through a military coup inside a military coup request us to leave, we will leave, certainly. We were there because you call us.
Yes, but the thing is now you're living a vacuum. You spoke about Libya.
Unhappily, these regimes want to fill this vacuum with the Russian Wagner companies, mercenaries. You know how they behave.
But Russia will say the same thing, that they've been invited by these countries.
Russia says that they don't know what mercenaries Wagner are. So let's be clear, it's not Russia, it's not the Russian army, it's the Russian mercenaries being paid for this job. And when we talk to the Russia, what's happening in the Mali with the Wagner companies, the cynical answer is, we don't know. We don't know who these people are.
Let's move to the Middle East. Some people are saying we tend to focus attention on the war in Ukraine right now. But you have this protracted conflict in the Middle East. Do you think the global community is doing enough to address that problem? I mean, we saw people dying this week from both sides.
I am extremely concerned about what's happening in the Middle East, personally and politically. And no, the international community do not do enough in order to face this conflict. You know, the European Union is the biggest supporter of the Palestinian Authority. Financially, we provide the biggest support to UNRWA, to support the schools and hospitals of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. We provide 600 million euros a year for the Palestinian Authority to continue supporting its services. And we raise up a voice and we support the two-state solution, and we are extremely worried by the spiral of violence that we are living these days, with the Palestinians being killed in a refugee camp, and this completely unacceptable attack to the people in a synagogue. You know, this has to stop, and we are trying to do whatever we can. But yes, you are right. The international community should engage more, and we will try to do with the Arab countries during the Munich conference something to address this situation.
Let's look at the recent challenges we faced around the world, the impact of COVID-19. All countries are struggling economically. What can be done to revive the global economy? Because it is not good to see only the big developed countries or the North or the Western countries recovering, while the developing South and poorer countries are struggling, because it's a recipe for disaster in terms of maintaining peace around the world. What can be done?
To support more the countries in jeopardize, in difficulties, well, to start building pharmaceutical capacities to face the new pandemics, as we have been doing. Yesterday, my colleague, the Commissioner for Health, was in Cape Town, providing an incredible amount of support to develop the pharmaceutical industry here in South Africa, because when the pandemic came, we realized that there were not capacity to produce vaccines in Africa. So we have to create pharmaceutical capacity. And we have to see how can we support people who are now facing maybe a new debt crisis. Mm-hmm. The world has been facing the consequences of the war. Mm-hmm. I think more than the pandemics, which is a threat today for the world economy, is the war in Ukraine.
And food security.
Food, energy, big prices, inflation's rocketing, central bank increasing interest rates.
All the time.
All at the time. It has never happened in this dimension, never in the history. It has been like such concentrated action of all central banks around the world raising interest rate. Can tell you my mortgage in Spain for my house, how the interest rate has increased. Everybody is paying much more. Mm. And debt countries will suffer more than others. So this is the consequences of the war. This is the consequences of the war. It's a war that not only affects the Ukrainians or the Europeans, it's sending shock waves around the world, increasing prices, increasing inflation, increasing interest rate, diminishing growth, and increasing the weakness of the people. That's why we have to fight in order to avoid the consequences of the war, to create a new world crisis, and to try to stop this war as soon as possible, but respecting the right of Ukraine to their sovereignty and integrity.
On the energy issue, we saw because of the war, countries were scrambling for resources to ensure that they do have energy supply. You engaged South Africa on the issue of just energy transition. Have you understood, or do you understand what are the concerns there in terms of the 8.5 billion loan that was given by the G7 member countries? Some of them are members of the EU, and EU supporting this, and the concerns that it has to be just, it has to be people-centered. What's your view? When you leave the shores, what's your view in terms of how we can go about this so that the world can also understand that for now, South Africa will continue to use coal while it's moving to renewables?
Look, the energy transition will have to be just, or it will not happen. To fight against climate change, we have to engage with the poor people in the world, which consumes very little energy, that they have to increase their energy consumption in order to reach higher levels of well-being, as we have, but they have to do it using a clean energy. And for that, we have to provide economic incentive and technological support. Look, Europe is 8% of the world emissions, 8%. If tomorrow, by miracle, Europeans were cancelling all our emissions, the problem would be still the same, because it would be 92% still. So the solution has to come from the parts of the world that still have to increase their energy consumption, and they have to increase their energy consumption, but in a different way. And the alternative has to be affordable, has to be cheap. Because if it is not economically affordable, people will not do it. If you have to choose between your economic development and your well-being and the climate, and there is no other solution, well, it's going to be difficult to sacrifice your future in order for a problem that will make a big difficulty to everybody, but it's not for tomorrow. Well, in some places it's already for today. So we have to engage on partnership, because if you decrease your emissions, it's good for us. It's a global problem. So if you do something, it's good for me. So it's logical that they help you to do something. It's logical that they help you to give a better, cheaper and greener energy. Not only greener, affordable, cheaper. If not, people will not use it.
Vice President, thank you for your time, and I hope all these issues, the world leaders will be able to address all these challenges with the G7 summit coming, and I think the interaction of the EU individually with perhaps South Africa and other countries. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your opportunity.
That was the Vice President of the European Union talking to us here in South Africa after a very high-powered delegation which descended on our shores, and on the backdrop of the Russians on Monday and the Americans on Wednesday. All eyes on South Africa, but particularly the continent, as South Africa is a gateway to Africa. Thank you.
Sophie Mokoena, they're out there for us, bringing us that conversation. Thanks very much indeed for that.